Hi everyone, it's Dr. Hinson here, one of the good doctors of Abbey Research, and I'm coming to you today with this video to talk through some of my thoughts after attending a recent conference in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So you may have seen my post from a few weeks ago that I was in Belfast to attend the Dangerous Oral Histories Conference hosted at my alma mater, Queen's University, Belfast. And I have to say, this was my first oral history conference, which are people who collect stories. Oral historians collect stories about a group or about an incident in order to provide a visual or an oral record of what took place. So it's my first conference with oral historians. I really liked them a lot. It was a fantastic conference in terms of content and engagement. But I did come at it from the perspective of what would be considered an academic outsider. Since Dr. Donnelly and I both have our PhDs, but are not in posts at universities or colleges or in a more traditional research setting. So we would be viewed in some parlance as non-academics, which is not true because we're still academics, but we're academics not working in the field of university or college studies. And you may have seen Dr. Donnelly and I's promotion of a pipeline that we have dealing with Life After Grad School. So this is a video that continues this discussion about engaging in academics and finding value and use for your skills once you've graduated, post-degree. So Life After Grad School. So this is Life After Grad School Part 2, for want of a better word. So I have five things that I want to go over that were thoughts that came to my mind while I was attending this conference. Number one, introverts at a conference. I could do a whole separate video on this, and I might. I was much more aware of other people who might be introverted at this conference than I had been before. But my advice always for people who are organizing any event, whether it's an academic conference or a networking event or some form of day-long event with speakers, think about the fact that there are introverts that are going to want to come, that might be interested in the material or engage with the discussions, but have completely different needs from more socially extroverted people. So for me, in order to be able to even just sit through a lot of the plenaries and academic sessions and panels throughout the day, I had to mind my level of social interaction outside of that. So limited social engagement. I do a lot of my networking at conferences on Twitter, which doesn't drain me as much, doesn't drain my energy resources as much as talking to people. And then I end up talking to a lot of people that follow me on Twitter, and it makes for a more engaging conversation than small talk, which is usually very draining for me as an introvert. Number two, I was thinking a lot about access to information and how people have access to the information that these academics want to disseminate. And you'll know that Dr. Donnelly and I are both fans of the musical Hamilton and the song The Room Where It Happens. You want to be in the room where it happens. And so I was thinking about that. We all have this very privileged access to be in the room where it happens. I paid a rather exorbitant conference fee that allowed me access to this information. But what are these people who are doing this wonderfully informative academic research, how are they giving access to their information to people who aren't privileged enough to be in the room where it happens? Number three, I had some thoughts about how we define value in terms of academic presentations. And I first had this thought when our first morning plenary session speakers were being introduced. And their value as academics was and is often defined in our introductions by the number of positions we've held and the number of publications we had. And this struck me as not the best way to define value within academia. And I think this is something Dr. Donnelly and I both push back against. What other types of tangible, practical contributions are academics making? Rather than publishing a book that is so expensive people can't afford it, or putting an article in a journal that nobody has access to, both of which I've done. in my traditional academic path. But how else are we conscious of making that information accessible, but how else are we defining value as well in terms of that? And alongside this definition of value, I was struck by the levels of quote-unquote professional dress. So in the United Kingdom and Ireland, you tend to have a bit more formal attire, even just in everyday life, than you would in the United States. You don't see people generally out in sweatpants or t-shirts and shorts. Usually the weather's not that warm either, but even if it was, a little bit more formal attire is kind of gender normative for all genders when they're going out and engaging professionally. So I dressed accordingly, but it was also the highest temperatures ever recorded in the history of Belfast. So we had a bit of a heat wave in buildings that are not designed to cool down, that don't have air conditioning. They don't have a lot of fans. They weren't prepared for this heat wave, certainly not at the conference. So it was fascinating to watch the gender differences in defining value and professionalism. And I noticed a lot of the gentlemen felt comfortable enough to wear shorts and t-shirts and tennis shoes. And it was not necessarily something that I think a lot of the women felt comfortable with, because our level of having to prove our professionalism is on a different standard because of that gender bias. So it was interesting to watch the dynamics of how women felt comfortable pushing back against those standards of professionalism, whether they did or didn't. And some women did, and some women didn't. But that was fascinating. Number 4, how non-academics are engaged and made welcome in these spaces. So a lot of that has to do with inviting people who work in community organizations, work for statutory agencies, etc. There was a level of this in the conference, but it was still primarily focused on delegates of the Oral History Society that was hosting the conference. And number 5, I thought a lot about access and restrictions in terms of barriers that people might face. And a lot of this was because I heard a brilliant paper from a colleague that was talking about the recognition of people with disabilities during the conflict in Northern Ireland. And she spoke from her own personal experience and the limitations that she struggles through facing in terms of even just physical access to spaces and buildings because of her disability. So when you're hosting a conference or an event, are you taking these into consideration? What is the access for people with disabilities or people who struggle with mobility, hearing, any other form of disability that's going to impact their ability to access the information and to engage in the event? Are you considering language barriers for people that are coming that have a different cultural background or a different language background? How are you addressing that in terms of democratizing that information? And even how you're dealing with gender differences. I overheard one delegate complaining that the bathrooms weren't gender neutral, and they felt uncomfortable, that they felt forced into going into the female toilets or the ladies' restroom when that necessarily wouldn't have been their choice. So all of these considerations you need to take into account when you're planning these events. So those are my 5 thoughts following an academic conference. If you're hosting events and you're in an academic space or you're in a non-academic space, you have academic training or you don't, these are all considerations that you should be making to make your event as diverse and inclusive and as accessible to as many people as possible. So with that, I'm Dr. Hinson, one of the good doctors of Abbey Research, and that is all I have for you for now. Take care, everybody.